Another tutorial session. Tonight we're going to talk about macroeconomics, and we'll fill out kind of the last part of the course where we expand the ISLM model to the open economy and see how currency exchange rates are used to bring both countries into balance, into equilibrium. So the ISLM model, once you open it up to multiple economies that are exchanging trade, we have to be able to somehow adjust and balance things out so that the real world interest rate is stable throughout the world. If you're in a large economy and you do something that affects your economy, then you might have some strong influence on the world interest rate. So if you do a fiscal expansion, and that would cause your interest rate to change, then you might have enough influence to drive the rest of the world in that same direction. So the U.S. might be in that position, but for most countries, most economies, they're smaller and they are unable to kind of buck the trend of the rest of the world. And so we'll look at what happens in an open economy with small economies that have to take the real world interest rate as a given. And we'll see how that works out. A couple of key things you have to keep in mind. Remember that Y, or GDP, is equal to the consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And the key thing there is net exports, because we'll see how that drives the balance of the economies. And of course, the national savings equal to gross national product, which is gross domestic product, plus net factor payments, minus consumption, and minus government spending. And I think the key thing here is if government spending goes up, then the national savings will tend to go down. Let's see how that works out. First, before we get into the open economy, let's just review the closed economy example. And what we'll do here, we'll take a case of the fiscal policy expansion. In other words, the government will increase spending without raising taxes. They're going to increase their deficit. That is, they're going to reduce national savings. And the goal here is to boost the economy and get Y going up. And they're pretty successful at that. So what we're going to see here is that when you increase government spending, don't raise taxes, you're going to increase your deficit, and it causes national savings to decrease. So what you're going to see is the savings line here is going to move left. And that means that we're going to reach a new savings and investment equilibrium. So we're going to move to this new point after moving our savings back. So we'll go from, say, point A to point B. And at the same time, this will cause a new interest rate to happen. The interest rate goes up. And of course, this action, the reduction in savings, will shift the IS curve right and up. And so this curve in the ISLM graph will be shifting to the right, like that. And so that's going to have an effect that Y will increase. We're going to boost the economy, and at the same time, we're going to be increasing the interest rate from its previous state. Now, what can happen here? The central bank can support this fiscal policy expansion, and in order to do that, they're going to have to increase the money supply. Once they do that, that will shift the LM curve right. So something like this. And once that happens, they're going to, again, move down and shift the interest rate down, hopefully to what it was before, and then the output will increase even further. And so the sequence here is we'll start at point C. The fiscal policy expansion will move IS. That will raise the interest rate. And then if the central bank decides to support that, they can actually enhance it by increasing the money supply, which will bring us back to the original interest rate and further raise the output of the economy. If this level, Y, I'll call it Y2 here, is greater than the natural level, what's going to happen typically is in the long run, the prices will adjust. In other words, we'll experience inflation in order to bring that level of economic activity, the GDP or Y, back to where it should be. So we'll have a price increase. The real money supply will decrease because the denominator increases. The LM curve will shift left. Y will return to its natural level, and R will then increase. And so the effect of kind of pushing the economy into overdrive in the long run will cause inflation to increase, so the price level will increase. That will tend to decrease the real money supply. That'll pull the LM curve left again, and Y will reduce back to its natural level at the cost of raising the interest rate yet again. So this is how the closed economy functions, and it's fairly straightforward. Things get a little bit more complicated when we look at an open economy, and as I mentioned earlier, we'll deal with small open economies where the two economies essentially cannot force a change to the world real interest rate. That's going to be pretty stable, pretty steady. But there are a couple of different things here. Since we're going to be looking at the exchange rate, there are a couple of different policies that can be in place. And let's look first at a floating exchange rate, where governments let the market determine what the exchange rate is between currencies. So domestic currency can buy a certain amount of a foreign currency, and the markets will determine how much of that foreign currency you can exchange your domestic currency for. And again, we'll take that same idea that we'll use a fiscal policy expansion, that is, governments will increase G. And I think a very key factor here, key point to understand is that in an open economy, with floating exchange rates, the financial markets react very quickly. And so what that means is that when something happens to the economy that requires a change in the exchange rate in order to bring things back into balance, that can occur in seconds. The markets around the world will adapt to the state of things almost immediately. This is in contrast to things like the price level. Well, price level tends to be very sticky, and so like in the previous case, the price level here can only bring things back into the normal equilibrium over the long term. It will take some time before inflation will increase to the point where um, the price level brings the money supply back to a normal level. But in with the exchange rate, financial markets will make this happen almost instantaneously, I guess you would say. So we're going to do a fiscal policy expansion. We're going to increase our government spending. We're not going to increase taxes. Take care of that. Um, so what happens? So same idea happens as before. We have um, the domestic savings will decrease. So that savings line will move left. um, and you can see from the equation there for national savings that increasing that government spending is going to naturally pull the savings down. So the S curve shifts left. Well, remember, um, when we have an open economy, uh, the savings and investment equilibrium doesn't have to balance out in each economy, but it has to balance out in both economies as a whole. And it does that through the mechanism of foreign uh, exports, net exports minus imports, plus net factor payments, but they're very, very small uh, part of that. So normally we kind of look at the current account, that is the, the, um, the the current account is essentially equivalent to the net exports. So in this particular case, in our domestic world here, we have actually net imports. So our current account is that difference between savings and investment, and it is negative. So net exports is negative. So basically, the domestic economy is importing more than it's exporting. And that is balanced out perfectly by the current account of the foreign economy, where the net exports are positive. So we call this a current account surplus, and on the domestic side, we call it a deficit. And what happens is you would expect that those have to be equal. Uh, the net exports from uh, one economy has to perfectly balance the net exports from the other economy, and that will set the interest rate that prevails between those economies. So what we're doing here is we're going to move our savings curve to the left, and normally what you would expect to see or want to see is you would have an increase in that world interest rate in order to bring the current accounts into balance. So basically, um, the, the net export on the foreign side would have to be increased, and the uh, the net exports deficit on the domestic side, having been increased substantially by reduced savings, would then further contract a little bit in order to bring the two current accounts into balance. Um, the and of course, this pressure will push the IS curve to the right. And let me just complete the diagram here. So what we're going to have on the original savings is we'll call it point A. We'll start with the interest rate at that point. And the pressure here is going to be to try to increase that interest rate to bring things into balance. I'll call that point B. Um, so we're trying to move the interest rate up. It's going to push the IS curve to the right in order to bring those two into balance. And so it's going to look something like this. Um, we're going to try, let me change colors here. We're going to try to move the IS curve to the right, and that would bring the interest rate up, and it would bring Y up as well. So if we're starting here with the real interest rate there and the local domestic economy at Y1, we're going to shift, we would shift the IS curve to the right and up and reach point B here, which will give us a higher interest rate and a higher economic output. But the problem is this is a small economy, and just having the domestic economy uh, adopt an expansionary fiscal policy that would try to move this interest rate up and increase the output of the economy. Unfortunately, there's a lot of pressure in the rest of the world to maintain that real world interest rate because everything else is balancing out at that point. So something has to change here. Something else has to adjust in order to keep the local real interest rate equal to the world interest rate, and that's the issue with the small economy. The small economy cannot drive the rest of the world and change its interest rate based on uh, local policies. So what this is really going to do is it's going to require that the domestic current account deficit gets larger. That's a given because um, it's going to have to move to this level in order to get that savings down. And the foreign current account has to increase somehow in order to match that. So we've got to somehow make those equal without changing that real world interest rate. And so there's something else. We have to change something else. And what is that? Something else that happens by adjusting the exchange rate between the currencies of those two economies. So if you think of it, the upward pressure on the domestic interest rate here that you would see in that ISLM curve draws foreign capital in, hoping to earn a higher interest rate. So even if you move that interest rate up just a hair, the financial markets will jump on it and hope to get a little better yield on their money that they're investing in whatever assets they invest. Well, that of course changes the supply-demand balance for currency, for money. And so the demand for the domestic currency goes up, and that means the price of that domestic currency also goes up. And of course, the price is what we call the exchange rate, where the exchange rate for that domestic currency would increase so that that currency is now more valuable, and it takes more of the foreign currency to buy into that domestic currency in order to take advantage of any increase in interest rates. So our domestic currency is appreciating now, and we can see how that works out in the net exports graph here. We have on the x-axis, we have net exports, which are a function of that exchange rate. Obviously, as the exchange rate changes, the value or the cost of products imported or exported will change. So if our domestic exchange rate increases, making our currency, domestic currency, more valuable, then foreign products will cost less. And so we'll tend to increase the imports and reduce our exports. And so what's happening here, this vertical line here, the blue line, happens to be the case here where we have a current account deficit. So we're in the negative region. And that line represents the current account, savings minus investment, the difference between the two. As we shift S down, savings goes down, the current account goes more negative. As you can see here, it goes from that width to the wider width. And so that current account line also shifts left, like that. And what that does is it brings the exchange rate up to make that balance. So we'll go here from A to B. And so we're going from an exchange rate here to a new higher exchange rate where the domestic currency has appreciated. It's more valuable and we'll buy more foreign currency for the same amount. So now we're driving this exchange rate up, and the effect of the exchange rate going up is now we're changing our net exports. We're changing the domestic net exports to be lower, in fact, more negative. So we're increasing the size of the current account deficit, and correspondingly, the foreign economies will be sending more products over to the domestic economy, so their net exports will increase by the same amount. So since the domestic net exports decrease, Y will increase. Y decreases, and you can see that from the equation shown there. Net exports go down. Our output has to go down as well because we're not shipping as much product across to the foreign economy, and the IS curve has to shift back left. So what we have is initially the IS curve shifts out to the right, and we would go from our original equilibrium point here with the real world interest rate and our starting output. We would tend to push IS curve out to the right, and that would tend to push the interest rate up. We would expect a new equilibrium at this point with an output increase to Y2 and a new higher interest rate there. But since the domestic net exports decrease and Y decreases, everything gets pulled back. So the IS curve shifts right back left. And so we'll move back to where it originally started, and we're back to the original real world interest rate and the original Y value. So what's happening here is we're allowing, let's see if I can get that, find the right picture. We're allowing the current account to get more negative such that it's the amount of that deficit is large enough that it matches the real world interest rate, and we don't need to shift the real world interest rate up in order to balance things out. We're going to maintain that same new current account deficit. So S, we haven't increased our savings at all. Our savings still stay lower, and our investments unchanged because that isn't impacted by this. but we remain at the real world interest rate because we're making sure that the current account deficit in the domestic economy is larger, that is more negative, and somehow that's got to bring out a corresponding change in the foreign economy that will make that possible. So the question you might have is how does this IS and current account balance work? So here's the same picture. We have the domestic savings shifts left, and the original current account deficit was this, and it was balanced out by a current account surplus in the foreign economy that had the equal size. Now we're shifting the shifting the S curve left, and that would increase this deficit. Normally, you would expect the interest rate to increase, but since the world actually has more control of that real world interest rate, we're going to force the interest rate in these two economies to stay equal to the real world interest rate, R star. So what happens is the exchange rate rises so that we can adapt the net exports or adjust the next net exports so that even at that real world interest rate that exists, the current account deficit of the domestic economy will increase in size. That is, net exports will become more negative. And that also means that the foreign net exports increase correspondingly. So what we end up with is a new level of current account deficit and a new level of current account surplus, because what happens here is now that we have more exports in the foreign economy, there's more savings to be had, more income, more savings, and so their savings moves out and their current account surplus increases. And so that's how those things are kept in balance. The current account deficit is balanced out with the current account surplus in the foreign economy at the same world interest rate. So, quick review. We have a government fiscal policy in the domestic economy that's trying to boost the economy, increasing the government purchases without increasing taxes. That reduces the national savings. In an open economy, this would put some pressure on interest rates to increase in order to balance out the net exports between the two economies. But since the world interest rate is essentially hard and fast, it's controlled by the rest of the world, not these two economies. It means that somehow we've got to keep that real world interest rate and somehow adjust something else in order to keep the current account deficit and surplus in balance. And the thing that will adjust there is the exchange rate, essentially the price of one currency in terms of the other. And in this particular case, what happens is the exchange rate for the domestic exchange rate, that is, how many foreign units of currency can be bought with a unit of domestic currency, that has to adjust. And once that adjusts, that changes the desired net exports In fact, since the domestic currency is appreciating, it's more valuable, it makes it makes foreign products cheaper, uh, and therefore we would tend to buy more foreign products, and our products are more expensive to the foreign economy, and so they would buy fewer of our products, and both of those things reduce um, the net exports. It's already negative. It goes further negative. Imports exceed exports, and so that uh, at the same interest rate, that allows that uh, the current account deficit to increase, and to in order to balance that out at that same real world interest rate, the foreign economy has to increase its surplus. Their net exports go up, and because of that, they're increasing their output and their savings are going up. Make sense? I hope. Once you put it all together, it's actually pretty simple. Instead of adjusting the interest rate in order to bring the open economies into balance, we're changing the exchange rate, the relative value of the two currencies to make that happen. Let's take a different scenario, and this is the same idea. We have a small open economy, two small open economies, and we're going to um, increase our government spending in the domestic economy, but we have a fixed exchange rate. And a fixed exchange rate means that we somehow have to guarantee that the price of the foreign currency is the same no matter what we do, no matter how things change in the economy. And so, as you might imagine, there has to be some active manipulation of this, active control of this. Otherwise, if you left it up to market forces, we'd see what we saw in the previous scenario, which is the exchange rates will adjust, they'll move in order to bring everything back into equilibrium. So if we have a fixed exchange rate, let's assume it's fixed for the moment, and we do a government increase in government purchases, the economy should expand, the savings goes down, national savings goes down, and the IS curve shifts to the right. It shifts things from point A here up to point B. We have a new, we would have a new interest rate, and it puts pressure to increase the exchange rate. Like we saw in the previous example. But the central bank policy is that we want to hold that exchange rate constant. So what's going to happen is that we're somehow going to have to bring the LM curve down so that we're back to the real world interest rate, which we cannot change. And we have to do that somehow without um, changing the world exchange rate. And that's the idea of moving that LM curve. The way you do that is by increasing the money supply. And so the central bank is going to throw out some more money into the economy. It's going to shift the real money supply out to the right, just enough that that LM curve will shift to the right to bring the interest rate that brings things into balance again back to the same real world interest rate. So we're going to go from this point down to this point. Now, as you might imagine, this is going to happen very quickly. Otherwise, there'll be a lot of pressure on the exchange rate. Maybe not so much market pressure, but political pressure to change that exchange rate. And so the central bank has to react fairly quickly, increase the money supply in order to bring the interest rate back down. to where it has to be in order to balance out the economies around the world. And once you do that, there's your net exports are again balancing out. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. So we looked at the fixed exchange rate and the market-based floating exchange rate for a fiscal policy action. Let's take a look at what would happen on the same two cases if we have a monetary policy change. And for an example, we'll take a monetary expansion. That is, the central bank will increase the money supply, M, and as we saw before, the LM curve shifts to the right. That would tend to push R down, so we would move from where we started here in equilibrium, and it would tend to move it down here to point B, some new lower interest rate and a higher output from Y1 to Y2. But then, of course, our domestic interest rate now is tending down. It's being pushed down, and that makes people, holders of domestic capital, want to look for a better return, and they could find that in a foreign market in order to get better yield. They get a little higher interest rate because that's still at the real world interest rate. And like in their first example, this pushes the exchange rate now lower, and our domestic currency depreciates. And so the result of that is our net exports, the domestic net exports, increase because now the domestic products are less expensive to foreigners and vice versa. The foreign products are more expensive. And what that ends up doing is it ends up shifting the IS curve to the right. We have adjusted those current accounts, and so that now moves the IS curve to the right or up. And then that further increases Y up to Y3. And point C here. And again, the mechanism here is the exchange rate is changing in order to make sure that that interest rate in the domestic economy matches the real world interest rate. So money demand is going up, output's increasing, money demand's going up. We're going to walk up that LM curve until we reach that same equilibrium worldwide real interest rate, R star. So the bottom line here is that we remain, after we do a monetary expansion, we increase the money supply, the interest rate is actually unchanged. The economic output Y has increased, and our currency has depreciated in order to bring things back into balance at that same interest rate. And it means that our domestic current account deficit will be reducing. It'll be moving more towards exports. And then finally, we've got one last scenario where we're going to have the central bank doing a monetary expansion. They're going to be increasing the money supply, but now we're working under a fixed exchange rate policy. So if the central bank is trying to do an expansion of the economy and they increase the money supply, that's going to shift the LM curve down and to the right. And that, of course, would tend to push R down and increase Y as well. So we're going to have those same forces. If the domestic interest rate starts to go a little bit lower than the real world interest rate, it means that domestic capital will move to foreign markets to get the real world interest rate rather than the slightly lower domestic rate. And that would tend to push the exchange rate lower in order to bring balance back into the economies and depreciate the domestic currency and raise the interest rate back up to the real world interest rate. But since the policy of the central bank here, or the politics, are to keep that exchange rate fixed for whatever reason, the central bank only has one tool, and that is they're going to have to reduce the money supply in order to restore LM back to where it was. So we're going to go from point A here to point B, and then back to point A. So by holding to a policy of a fixed exchange rate, basically that removes the flexibility that the central bank has for monetary expansion. And in fact, in order to keep that fixed exchange rate, they have to keep adjusting the money supply in order to bring things back into balance. So essentially, with a fixed exchange rate, the central bank has no ability to control the money supply and the consequences of being able to adjust that. So that's about it. This is really the kind of the culmination of the model for economies, the ISLM model that lets us take what should be the long-range picture where employment is at its natural level of employment and the economy output is at its proper output based on the factors of production that it has and the efficiency and productivity of those factors, and the level of the desired level of expenditures and consumption and savings and investment, brings that into the full picture in the long run. And then as we see perturbations to our economy, things like changing money supply or changing in taxes or changing the productivity of the economy or something like that, oil price changes, some kind of shock, the ISLM model allows us to understand how things are going to be impacted and, most importantly, what you can do, particularly the central bank, what the central bank can do, or fiscal policy from the government can do in order to bring things back or try to bring things back to normal long-term status. So if there's a recession, there's things that can be done to bring it back up. And if there's an expansion period that's getting overheated, there are things that it can do to bring it back down to what should be the normal rate. And then we've opened up that model for open economies, and we find that it's in a small open economy, small meaning the economy is not big enough in order to impact or drive changes in the real world interest rate. And so that interest rate is going to bring the entire world into equilibrium, but it changes in one of the small economies have to do something else in order to keep things in balance with the rest of the world, their foreign partners, and that thing that changes now is not the interest rate, but it's the exchange rate, the relative pricing of the domestic and foreign currencies. And so that's the mechanism that brings things back into balance. And of course, we can use that model then to look at what's going to happen when changes, perturbations, or shocks happen in the short term. And because financial markets control floating exchange rates, financial markets work very, very quickly. Therefore, exchange rates can adapt very quickly. And so short-term adjustments, bringing things back into balance can happen almost instantaneously. Okay, that's it. Good luck on your exams. Exams this weekend, stats and macro. And then I hope you have a very pleasant, relaxing holiday after that.